All right, cool. So we are going to get started. And let me just change the view here. There we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give Alan, our guest speaker today, a brief introduction, and then I'm going to cue him through some questions, and we'll probably have some really great educational information that comes out of that. And at the end, we'll have plenty of time for some questions and answers because I'm sure you guys will have a lot of questions after going through this, if that sounds like an okay plan. So, our guest today is Alan Williams. He is and correct me if I get any of this wrong, okay, he is a sixth generation family farmer, founding partner of Grass Fed Insights LLC, Understanding Ag LLC, a great resource. The website has a ton of information on it, and the Soil Health Academy, which I checked out. Alan pioneered many of the early regenerative, I get that, it's so hard to pronounce, regenerative, there we go, grazing protocols and forage finishing techniques, and now teaches those practices and principles to farmers globally, basically trying to give farmers a better way to do things, perpetual residual income that is sustainable, better nutrition, better for everything involved, better for the planet. He holds a bachelor's and a master's in animal science and a PhD in livestock genetics. So the guy's kind of smart. And he's authored more than 400 scientific papers and popular press articles. So thank you so much for being here today, Alan.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. Glad to be here.
Yep, we are too. We had a great discussion. I don't remember when that was, maybe like a month and a half ago. So I know this is going to be really, really useful info. If I could set an intention for today, it's to have a discussion that will give my people and anyone that watches or listens to this after the fact some education on these important topics, which hopefully will give us some leverage to make better decisions. And hopefully towards the end, we can come up with some actionable steps from a consumer standpoint, and also from someone that's just trying to start out with a farm or something like that. How does that sound?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So, Alan, what's your story? Like, how did you get to where you are, and why are you doing what you're doing? I think that's a good place to start.
Yep. So, born and raised in South Carolina on my family's farm. They've been there since 1840. So, I represented the sixth generation, and I'm the oldest son. For all of my formative years growing up, I was absolutely convinced I was going to stay on the family farm for the rest of my life, and continue the tradition. And had full intentions to do so. Went away to college at Clemson University and got my bachelor's degree. And then I did go back home to the farm. But I had this very persistent major professor that kept calling me up and asking me to come back to grad school. And for almost 2 years, I kept turning him down. But finally, I sort of caved in, I guess, and did go back to grad school, and then got talked into going on for a PhD. So I did my PhD at Louisiana State University. And then, oddly enough, I felt obligated at that point to go into academia. So I did. And I spent the next 15 years of my life as a researcher and a professor, ending up at Mississippi State University. So I now live in Mississippi, and that's how I originally got here. So in the 15 years of academia, I became pretty entrenched, pretty heavily involved in what I would call the conventional commodity mindset of agriculture. And, the vast majority of all the research that we do at our universities is centered around, that concept of agriculture. But so I was a tenured full professor. I was very good at what I did there. I received, research awards, teaching awards, those types of things. Pumped out a lot of peer-reviewed publications and brought in a lot of grant dollars, which is what you're supposed to do, right? So I was the good soldier, so to speak, in academia, and could have spent my entire career doing that. But 15 years in, again, tenured, full professor, fully vested, I kept asking myself a lot of questions. And I had to go back to what I experienced on the family farm growing up. first of all, that my family for 6 generations have been able to fully support themselves. And I'm not talking about just mom and dad, okay? I mean, we're talking about extended family that were involved. There were always at least 4 living generations on the farm, my entire lifetime. And there were aunts and uncles and cousins and so forth, all involved and all making a living. But I started noting that, it was becoming increasingly more difficult for people to make a good living on the farm or on the ranch. And it was extremely difficult for them to bring their children or grandchildren back into the operations. Our soils, in spite of all of our research, our soils were not getting better. Our soils were continuing to degrade and decline and becoming more and more reliant on external inputs just to achieve, the same level of production. Our livestock, our animals, the same way. They weren't getting healthier. They were becoming increasingly reliant on all types of pharmaceuticals and supplements and so forth to continue to produce. And I kept going back to what I experienced growing up on the farm and the fact that in the 60s and 70s, we didn't use any of that stuff. So all of these things that I was researching and we were convinced we now need and we must have, somehow my family had existed quite well for 6 generations without any of that. So those hard questions then caused me to question, what was I doing with my life and my career? So I had a very difficult decision to make. I could either stay at the university another 15 years till full retirement and keep doing what I was doing, or I could leave so that I could try to make a real difference. And so I made the decision to resign and to leave the university. That was in the year 2000. And ever since then, I can say it's been absolutely a whirlwind. We are regenerative farmers and ranchers ourselves. So we personally do this. I personally farm in the states of Mississippi and Alabama. All of my partners in Understanding Ag are real life farmers and ranchers as well in their respective states. And today, as Understanding Ag and the Soil Health Academy, we've been able to work with literally thousands of farmers and ranchers all over the world. We've worked in all 50 US states and 41 different countries. In the US alone, we're working across about 32 million acres that are under regenerative transition.
Wow.
And, we have been able to make just, this incredible progress that never could have happened in the university setting.
Yeah.
So we've been incredibly blessed, and that's where we are today.
That had to take a lot of courage, to turn your back on everything that you had been taught and had been teaching. How did you take that first step? Like, if there wasn't, I'm sure at that point in time, there wasn't a whole lot of resources. So where did you, if you knew there was something that needed to be done different, where did you go to? I'm just curious.
Boy, that is a really good question. You're exactly right. At that point in time, the resources were very scarce.
Was Joel Salton doing his thing at that time, or
Joel had just sort of started, really? And so the Joel that we know today was not, that Joel back in 2000, 2001. And many of the people that we consider sort of the pioneers and gurus of regenerative agriculture today were just like me. They were really just sort of getting started at that time. So it took a lot of trial and error, to be honest with you. I started implementing things that honestly I really didn't know how to properly implement, because we didn't know near as much then as we do now. So a lot of trial and error on my own farms and using my own pocketbook, my own money, right, to do that. So we didn't have grants or university funding or anything like that. It was all on me. So the trial and error, but what I did do, I was both speaking at a lot of conferences and attending a lot of conferences and workshops. And I also took time to go visit a lot of different farms and ranches where, whether you talk about Gabe Brown, Greg Judy, or, many, many others that I could name here, we just started learning from each other, to be quite honest.
And then have
And
this network of people that was sharing information. So the
that
way it should be.
that is
Yeah.
correct. Yeah. And all of us, in essence, to a certain extent, we're flying by the seat of our pants, in doing that. But the amazing thing, and as a scientist, that this is what really solidified in my mind that this really works, is that there were a number of us doing this completely separate from each other and in very different parts of the country, so different climates, everything. And yet we were finding very similar results, and that's about the soundest science that you can have, to be honest with you. And that's what convinced me this absolutely does work. Now we just need to put this all together.
Yeah, I love that. I love that kind of confirmation because I've had that too with a lot of the health principles that I teach. I feel like the people that I have been in contact with for the amount of time that I've been doing this, around 10 years, we all gravitate towards the same exact principles. We're all doing very similar things. So that is great to get that confirmation. So can you just briefly just explain what is agriculture? What do we mean by agriculture when we say that?
Well, agriculture in general is simply the production of food,
Okay.
whether
Plants and
it's
animals.
plants or animals, right? It's both. So agriculture is the production of any kind of plant-based food or any kind of animal protein that we can think of. So that's agriculture. Now, regenerative agriculture, we define like this: regenerative agriculture is farming and ranching in synchrony with nature and the four ecosystem processes to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem function, starting with life beneath the soil. And that's key. Starting with life beneath the soil and expanding to life above. That's how we define regenerative agriculture.
Love it. Love it. So could you give it, like, what is, in your opinion, what is the biggest problem with the modern agricultural system?
We
only got about an hour here. But.
I know it. We could talk days on that, but I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. First and foremost is it has become highly, highly prescriptive. And regenerative agriculture is not prescriptive at all. It is highly adaptive. When you deal with biology and nature every single day, you know that you're always getting thrown curveballs, right? Nothing's ever the same from day to day, month to month, year to year.
It's a very complex system.
Hugely complex. And when we try to deal with it in a prescriptive manner, then what happens is we always hit a wall. Okay. We may make a little bit of progress initially, but then we hit a wall beyond which we can't continue to make progress. And then we start to digress. And then we decide that, well, we just need to change the prescription to another one, and then another one, and then another one. And that's really sort of been the road that we keep going down. And I'll give you this quick analogy to help, your viewers understand this. So, let's think about a human athlete. Okay. So if we're going to continue to progress as a human athlete, we can't keep doing the exact same exercise routine at the same duration and intensity day after day, year after year. If we do, we're going to stagnate and then we're going to go backwards, right? And every athlete knows that. So they routinely alter their exercise routine to keep introducing new challenges. Well, we're biology. So is and if we respond that way, we've got to have new challenges, new stimuli to continue to progress. So does all the biology out here on our farms and ranches. It responds the same way. It needs adaptive responses, not prescriptive responses. So that's first and foremost. But the second thing is that modern agriculture has become highly monoculture based. We have moved away from diversity and polyculture type agriculture so that farmers are taught and told to specialize. You are growing just corn and beans, you're growing just wheat, you're growing just this, or you're just a cow calf producer, or whatever the case may be. And so we have basically eschewed diversity in favor of specialization in monoculture. And that has created a lot of negative impacts. And so what we espouse and teach and promote within regenerative agriculture, and what we do ourselves, is adding in as much diversity as we possibly can. And it works incredibly well for expanding ecosystem function. The third thing is the increasing reliance on external inputs. And this has created multi-billion-dollar support industries, right? That sell farmers their seed, their fertilizer, their chemicals, their equipment, on and on and on. And so that's become a very real deal. And then the last thing that I'll mention today, again, like I said, we could go into so many different areas, but the last thing I'll mention is that it has also created a very heavy debt burden on farmers. And today, farmers and ranchers, particularly in the US, but we also see this globally, have the highest level of debt that they've ever had in history. And this high level of debt is leading to very poor decision making. It's hard to make good decisions when you're deep in debt. It has also led to high levels of depression and to suicide. Do you know that farmers have one of the highest rates of suicide of any profession in the US? And this is the oldest profession in the world, one of the noblest professions. It should come with a deep level of satisfaction. And instead, farmers are committing suicide. Now, that can't keep happening.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe because when we talked the other day, you went through a history of the food system. So I'm sure that, considering where we are, whatever started us down this path, the intentions had to be good in the beginning. So maybe could you go through like a little bit of a kind of like a food system history, or maybe as it pertains to agriculture, just to explain how did we get from your family doing things the right way unknowingly, and then to this situation that we're in right now?
Yeah. So there's a host of things that happened here. One of them is spelled out pretty well in Mark Schatzker's book, The Dorito Effect. An excellent read. I recommend that to anybody. And Mark's a good personal friend of mine, but Mark in The Dorito Effect traces when we went from whole foods, real foods, to all of these highly processed, artificially flavored foods. So take a look at that to track the history of that. And all of that was really when gas chromatography was invented. Then that allowed us to start partitioning out and creating all of these artificial flavors. And the reason the book's called The Dorito Effect is because the original Dorito was just a plain corn chip. And it was going nowhere with the consumer. But once gas chromatography and being able to partition out and add all of these different flavors, then the Dorito exploded, and now you can get a Dorito in practically every flavor known to man. Yeah. So that's one of the things that happened. But then the really, really big deal was World War II. Okay. And during World War II, we had major corporations that were working to supply things to the Department of Defense. And that included nitrates, phosphates, and so forth for making bombs and other weaponry. And at that time, the government was encouraging farmers because they had no idea how long World War II would last. They had no idea whether the US would be invaded. And so they were encouraging farmers to overproduce grains. Yeah. And so after World War II ended, we got to remember what happened in the 1930s, pre-World War II, the Dust Bowl, right?
Yep. I remember you talking about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, we had, so let me back up just briefly here and talk about that because that's important to what happened along with the nitrates and phosphates after World War II. But so we experienced the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, a very traumatic event relative to agriculture. And the one thing that we have to remember is that we created that Dust Bowl using single tree plows pulled with animals. Okay. And it only took about 50 years from the 1880s to the 1930s for the Dust Bowl to be created using animals and plows pulled behind these animals. So we overplowed using what today would be considered a very rudimentary type plow, right? And as a matter of fact, one thing I always tell people is every one of those farmers farming during that time period and up until the time of the Dust Bowl, under today's certified organic standards, would have been a certified organic farmer. They were using no chemicals, no synthetics, none of that, but they still created the Dust Bowl. Okay. Even though under today's standards, they would be considered certified organic. And then we moved to World War II and
Now,
post World
can I
War II.
stop you
Yep,
real quick there, Alan? So the
absolutely.
Dust Bowl. So what you're saying here is the over plowing, over tillage of the land, kind of moving towards monocrops in some way. Not at the level that we have today, was depleting the soil, and that's what contributed to the Dust Bowl. Is that correct?
Hugely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You can't plow and plow and plow, guys. It just, and as a matter of fact, if you look at what has happened in 2021 and 2022 across North America relative to our temperatures, our drought, all of that, the only other time in history, in modern history in the U.S. that rivals that is the 1930s Dust Bowl. It is eerily similar. The temperature extremes that we've been experiencing and the drought that we've been experiencing is eerily similar to the 1930s Dust Bowl. And why is it similar today? Because we have gone back to excessive tillage, excessive plowing, across the continent, leaving too much soil bare for too long a period during each year. So, and as a matter of fact, I now tell people we are actually in our second Dust Bowl. We are experiencing a second Dust Bowl. We have had massive dust storms every year since 2011, and they continue to occur. Yeah.
So that was our first indication, and then you said you were going into about World War II and having the excess ingredients for explosives and bombs and things.
Yeah. So the government wanted to keep the companies that had been supplying them with these products alive and thriving in case we had another war, right? And they needed to call on them again. So the government was very, very encouraging in terms of having them finding a way to transition the nitrates and the phosphates into another use, a la fertilizer, right? So here we go. And then Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution and so forth, came about. And of course, remember, we had just had the Dust Bowl, so we weren't at all far removed from the very negative impacts on our soil of the Dust Bowl. So the soils were severely depleted, and all of a sudden we're applying these new nitrogens and phosphates to the soil. Well, of course they made things grow because our soils were severely degraded, severely depleted. They needed something, right? So it appeared to be a miracle. Now that voila, we've got all of this stuff now, the synthetic fertilizer, and now we can produce all the food we need. And so during the late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that was viewed as, the best thing that ever happened to mankind. But what we did not know at the time were the unintended consequences that would come about because of that. So, we now know that you can severely overapply synthetic fertilizers, and it has a very, very negative impact on our soils, on our plants, on nutrient density of the foods that we eat, and it has a negative impact on a multiplicity of life, from life, microorganisms and earthworms and all of that beneath the soil to life above the soil. And then, of course, the other thing that happened during World War II and then was further developed during the Korean War and the Vietnam War were all of the chemicals that we use today. All of the herbicides, the insecticides, the fungicides, and so forth. And so again, developed initially with good intentions, but through overuse of those tools, we have created again a lot of very significant and severe unintended consequences that have significantly destroyed a lot of our ecosystems and that have damaged nutrient density in foodstuffs, and of course introduced levels of toxins into our foods that we're consuming every day.
Yeah, and you had gone through this example about like how we're adding nitrogen and these other external inputs to produce a plant that looks normal and looks healthy. Whereas in the process of regenerative agriculture, you've got all the nitrogen that you need at the right times and the right amounts versus being hit with this huge bolus at one point. Could you just go into that just a little bit? I thought that was so fascinating.
Yeah. So, what farmers tend to do today is rely very heavily on doses of synthetic nitrogens. And these synthetic nitrogens are quickly taken up and utilized by the plant and then done, so then they have to reapply and reapply. And one of the problems with applying either synthetic nitrogens or phosphates is that they are very inefficient. So when you buy and apply nitrogen, at best, you'll get 60 to 70% utilization by the plant, and the rest of it is lost. It's lost through volatilization, denitrification, leaching. So it ends up either back in our atmosphere as a gas, or it ends up, in our streams, our bays, our Gulf, lakes, things like that. And the same thing with the phosphates, so they're very, very inefficient. You never get 100% utilization or even close to it for these purchased fertilizers. The other thing that happens, obviously, is that because they're not very efficient, we over apply, and we have been significantly over applying. And there's actually a lot of research that validates that, but the research tends to be ignored because it doesn't sell fertilizer, so it tends to get buried. But there is a ton of peer-reviewed research that actually validates the fact that we've been seriously over applying the synthetic fertilizers. They acidify the soil. They salinate the soil because all of these fertilizers have salts attached. So they create, saline conditions in our soils over time. They create low pH or acidification of our soil. And they create significant compaction in our soil because they overwhelm and damage the soil biology. They damage the mycorrhizal fungi, and they damage soil bacteria and soil protozoal populations. So we have soil microbial population damage, and we have earthworm damage. So they actually damage the earthworms that are working for us. So a whole host of things going on there. Now, you contrast that with what is actually available. So first, in the atmosphere, every single day over every single acre on the earth, there are more than 32,000 tons of nitrogen available. Okay. Now it's atmospheric nitrogen, it's N2. So it has to have something that converts it into a form of nitrogen that the plant can use, right? But that's where our soil biology comes in. It has the ability to do that. But my point is, we have 32,000 tons of nitrogen available every single day over every single acre. So why are we buying and applying nitrogen? And secondly, we frequently do what are called total nutrient digestion soil tests. And we've done these, Paul, all over North America. And what we have found is that in the top 6 to 8 inches of soil only, not even going down deeper than that, on almost every single one of these soil tests that we have done on any acre, we have found at least 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of nitrogen in the soil. Yet we're buying and applying nitrogen. The reason being, we have so damaged the biology of the soil that the plant itself cannot take up that nitrogen. It needs interaction with the biology to be able to access and take up that nitrogen.
So then how does this process that you teach remedy that? Like, can you explain just in layman's terms a little bit about how going back to the way that your family used to do things actually remedies a lot of the problems that we're talking about?
You bet. So first of all, let's start with talking about what we call historical ecological context, because if you understand that, then you understand how it can be done. And what I'm talking about when I say historical ecological context is that one of the things that we do is we go back and study the history of any area that we work in. And we want to look at what was going on 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, what was growing there, what animals existed there, how much diversity was there, and how did it all function without all of the things that we say we need today, right? So the truth of the matter is, Paul, that our prairies and our grasslands and our savannas across the US and all of North America once produced far more plant biomass and growth than they do today. Even with all of our fertilizers that we add back, it was producing far more plant biomass then than it does today. Now, how did that happen without man buying and applying fertilizer? Well, it happened because it was all there and the system worked because we had not damaged the ecosystem and the biology, okay, of the soil.
It's basically like a self-contained system that renews itself and regenerates itself and perpetuates itself.
That millennia and incredibly well until we so significantly interfered with it, right? So what we do today by understanding that historical ecological context, what it once was, now we can understand what it can be again. And what we have discovered is that the biology is still there. We just have to create the conditions under which that biology can rapidly replicate to form enough of a population, a critical mass of the biological population to function like it did 500 and 1,000 years ago. And so that's what we do. We recreate through regenerative agriculture those conditions so the biology can replicate, reproduce, and then thrive, and then go to work for us. You know, we got to remember that biology is free. It doesn't cost us a penny. I don't write a check for the biology. I don't write a check for the sunlight, for the rain, none of that, right? So if I want to significantly lower my cost as a farmer and a rancher, then I've got to look at rebuilding, repairing, restoring that biology and putting that free biology back to work for me on my farm and my ranch. And that is, in a nutshell, that's how it's done.
So you're basically facilitating the conditions for this environment to do what it, I'm just picturing, 500,000 years ago, a very long time ago, all pieces of land go through seasons. So it's not that it would be producing this thing that we're hoping that it would produce indefinitely. So part of that is facilitating this environment that's going to create the ecology that would facilitate, the growth of things that we may want. But there's also seasons and cycles, and that's kind of what you do as well, right? Like there's your crop season, then you have animals that are a part of it. And then can you explain how all that ties together?
Oh, I'd be very happy to. So that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that one of the problems of modern agriculture is that we've become core focused on monoculture production, right? Well, and we did that because we were we were told over and over that that's what we must do to, quote, feed the world. Well, what we have discovered is that, every acre can produce a multiplicity of foods every single year. But you take the average corn and soybean farmer in the Midwest as an example. On any given acre, they're growing only corn or only soybeans in any given year, right? And that's it. So their whole revenue stream on a given acre is just corn or soybeans, nothing else. Well, why? Who said that that's all I can produce? So I can take those same acres. So after I harvest my corn, for instance, I can plant a complex or highly diverse cover crop. And now I've got my soil covered and protected. I'm still got living roots in the ground. I still got photosynthesis occurring. I still got carbon being drawn out of the atmosphere and put into the soil. All the good things happening that we want to happen, right? And then I can take livestock and graze that cover crop through the winter months and through the spring months. So now I've got a second revenue stream off that exact same acre. So instead, as a farmer, instead of just relying on just the corn as my revenue stream for the year from any given acre, I've got the corn that I sold. Now I've got livestock grazing that as a revenue stream. And I could have cattle grazing it, or I could have several livestock species grazing it. So I can have cattle, sheep. I could put pastured pigs on it. I can put poultry, pastured poultry on it. Okay. So I can actually produce in that off season, I could produce 4 or 5 different additional revenue streams off of the exact same acre. The other thing I can do, Paul, is I can put beehives out there, right? Because with this complex cover crop mix, I'm going to have a lot of flowering plants that the bees can forage on. So now I've got, up to a half dozen different revenue streams, a half dozen different foods being produced on the same acre. Why the heck are we not doing this?
It sounds fun and exciting too. I mean, to have that variety. But back to the animals. So you have your animals coming through, grazing the cover crops, right? The cover crops have protected the fields after the initial harvest of, whatever your main production was. But then those animals also fertilizing the fields as they go through it, right? So there's your cycle. Am I correct?
Well, and the animals are actually, yes, they're fertilizing, but they're doing more than that. Okay. So they're fertilizing it, particularly if we use adaptive grazing, where we're using temporary fencing and moving them every day. Okay. So that we've got a more concentrated, we get very even manure and urine distribution. And so we can actually supply 100% of the fertility that we need for the next cash crop through just that grazing of the animals without having to buy and apply any synthetic fertilizers or outside manures, because this is natural manure dropping straight out of the rear end of the animal. It's the most effective and efficient. And it actually has the same biology in it as the soil does. So it's very symbiotic with the biology of the soil. But the other thing that those animals are doing is they are shedding a lot of biology. So the microbiome on and in those animals is essentially the same microbiome that's in the soil. So they're shedding billions of microbes per animal back onto the soil, feeding the soil, okay, in this microbial population growth. So they greatly stimulate the growth of the microbial population in the soil. Their hoof action is stimulating the latent or native seed bank to stimulate far greater plant species diversity growing in the soil. And by that, if we just grew the cover crop and we didn't graze it, we would get far less carbon sequestration. By grazing and moving on and letting the cover crop regrow and grazing again, then every time that cover crop is grazed and has to regrow, it is going into hyperdrive from a photosynthesis standpoint and from a carbon sequestration standpoint. So we are getting a lot more carbon sequestered by doing this as well.
So then what are the biggest, if the expenses aren't spent on fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and things like that, what are the biggest expenses for these farmers? I'm just curious.
Yep. The biggest,
Irrigation and seeds.
well, they're going to have irrigation anyway if they're in a dry area, right? Like where you are in Idaho and that kind of thing. If they're farming at all, they're most of them are going to have put in irrigation. Some are doing dry land, but yeah. So the biggest expense is the cover crop seed cost, and then planting that cover crop seed, uh, and then if you're going to graze it, the temporary fencing and water to be able to supply water, and then the fencing to contain the livestock. But all of that can be temporary and portable, so it can be reused over and over. So it's very, very cost efficient and effective. And the fact of the matter is that even though you may have some initial upfront cost to do this, and if you don't have a no-till drill, purchasing a no-till drill, so that you're no longer tilling the ground, cultivating the ground, uh, then but the benefits that are derived by the farmer from this far outweigh the initial upfront cost. So their net margins actually improve significantly once you start applying this.
And then at what point are you planting a desired crop, or is that the way it works? Like after you have this cover crop and the animals coming through, maybe you do that a few iterations, how do you get to the next step of, producing something that you actually want to produce?
Yep. So, again, we can, for instance, like with corn, we can either plant a cover crop after we harvest the corn, or we can even interseed a cover crop in standing corn. So when corn is just a few inches high, okay, we call that the V2 to V3 stage of development, but it's just a few inches high. We can actually go in and interseed a cover crop at that point in time. And by the time we harvest our corn for grain or silage, then the cover crop is already there and it's already growing. Yeah. So we get to graze a lot quicker, and get that animal benefit in there a lot quicker. So then we would graze that in the fall, the winter, and the spring until you're ready to prepare that field and plant it again. And now the easiest thing to do is to go in and a lot of times we'll graze it and then allow it to grow back up. And we can use what is called a roller crimper, and we can roll down and crimp that cover crop to terminate it. And in the same pass with our no-till drill, plant the new cash crop. So replant it in corn, soybeans, wheat, whatever we're planting. So we can roll down the cover crop, and we call that planting green. And then that cover crop that you roll down and plant it into becomes it protects the soil temperature and moisture for the next cash crop. It suppresses weeds, right? Because it's your mulch. Why does anybody put a mulch down? To suppress weeds and to protect moisture. Same thing here. So it becomes your mulch in your row crop field to suppress weeds, protect soil moisture. And it also, as it degrades, then it releases nutrients to feed that cash crop. So that's one of the things that we do to be able to utilize cover crops and then cash crops on a sound rotational basis.
Okay, and then you mentioned a couple of times the tilling or plowing or something like that. So what's problematic about that?
Every time you plow, there's a whole host of problems with it. So first and foremost, every time you plow, you are releasing lots and lots of carbon back into the atmosphere. Unavoidable. You can't escape that. So all the carbon you've been trying to put back into the soil, you just released a good bit of it right back out up into the atmosphere. So you're losing carbon. You actually decrease soil organic matter every time you till. So you're losing organic matter in your soil. You are severely harming your soil biology. Okay, so like your mycorrhizal fungi, they're long, sort of thread-like. Think of them as spider webs interwoven underneath the soil. Well, if I'm tilling, what am I doing to all of that spider web of mycorrhizal fungi? Well, I'm just ripping it all up, right? So I just completely destroyed my mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And you also destroy your aggregate in the soil, and aggregated soil is what allows water to infiltrate and be retained in the soil. And it's also what allows oxygen to infiltrate into the soil. So I just destroyed my soil aggregate, my ability of my soil to infiltrate water throughout the season. And I destroyed my ability of my soil to oxygenate itself. Okay. The other things that happen is that, you're going to experience erosion. And erosion comes in two forms. You have water erosion. So when we have excess rainfall and we get erosion off of our plowed row crop fields through water, right? Then I've got that kind of erosion. So that's taking topsoil, nitrates, phosphates, all of those things with it into our waterways. And I can have wind erosion, the dust bowl, the dust storms. So we can have erosion, both water and wind erosion. So it exposes our soil to all of that. And then not the least thing that happens is your soil temperature greatly heats up. So now you've got all of this exposed soil surface. And I temp soils out west this year in June and July between 150 and 162 degrees. Now that's a temperature of a cooked food. I can eat food at cooked to 150 to 162 degrees, right? And we're heating our soils up to that temperature right there in your state in Idaho. I temp soils that were well over 150 degrees back in June and July. And so we're literally cooking our soils by having bare soil. And that's what tillage does. It creates bare soil. So when we heat our soils up like that, we lose almost all of our soil moisture. It all evaporates when it gets heated up, and it kills our soil microbes. So now we're losing the biology. So that's a long list of what happens, but that's exactly what happens when we till.
Well, then what is the purpose of tilling? What is the intended benefit? Like, why do so many farmers do it?
Farmers till because they've been taught to till. Okay. I mean, that's really the bottom line. And farmers think they have to till. They have so destroyed their soil that the biology is already gone. And this is from prior decades of tillage and centuries of tillage, right? But they have so destroyed their soils that the biology's gone. The soil's heavily compacted, inflated. It can't infiltrate and hold water. So they think they have to till to be able to get anything to grow, to get water back in the soil, to get oxygen back in the soil, all of this. They think they have to till to achieve that, right? And to grow their crops. So it's a learned behavior.
Yep. And what you're saying is these cover crops facilitate the mixture, the oxygenation, the holding on to the water and getting water deeper into the soil, and all these things that we would hope to benefits we'd hope to get from tilling.
They actually do. We've and again, talking about being out west this year on some farms and ranches, with a lot of our clients out there, we were evaluating their progress. And even in a single season of planting a complex cover crop mix, you are starting to build soil aggregation and water infiltration capacity. You are starting to build new soil biology. You are shading the soil and protecting it from the sun heating it up and killing those microbes and baking the soil. You are protecting soil moisture. So it does a multiplicity of things, as well as providing added fertility. And then when we combine the animals in with it to properly graze it it speeds all of that up. So you make even faster progress when you reincorporate the animals.
Man, that's just so fascinating. And it sounds like this is the way that we can rebuild our lands. The more and more people that adopt this way of farming, not only will it produce a variety of different foods and maybe different income streams for the farmers, but it also sounds like it's how we rebuild our soil. So that sounds promising and exciting.
Yeah, it is. And, the rate of progress that we make depends on how intentional we are with applying, what we call the 6-3-4, the six principles of soil health, the three rules of adaptive stewardship to be able to optimize the four ecosystem processes. So again, we call that the 6-3-4. And if we're really intentional about that and we're not cherry picking what we do, then the rate of progress is actually pretty phenomenal. It's far, far faster than we ever thought it could be. And it's far faster than many scientists believe. So that's hugely encouraging.
Yep, yep. Well, thank you so much for that whole background educational piece because I feel like that I understand things way better. It really excites me about the possibilities of moving forward. Can we just finish with what are some practical things that we can do at the consumer level to support doing the right thing? I mean, maybe through purchasing or something along those lines. And then what also can we do if we are interested, like I am, in starting a farm or a mini farm or something like that? What are the first steps that we can take? Maybe let's start with
Now,
the consumer piece. Like, what can we do as consumers to support the right way of doing things?
yeah, so actually the consumer is integral here if we're going to continue to make rapid progress because we, as farmers, we are now less than 1% of the US population. So our voice doesn't count for much. Okay. It
1% feeding the 99%.
That's exactly right. So
Crazy.
so the consumer is hugely important here. So the first thing that I would say is that, just like we have to educate farmers to be able to properly implement, regenerative practices and principles, the consumer needs to educate themselves as well through the proper channels. And, I'm well aware that the consumer is bombarded every day with a lot of very bad science and very bad information and are being led down all these paths, that this is bad, this is bad, this is good, whatever. And a lot of it is patently false, but it sounds good. And so it's very convincing to the consumer. So the first thing that I would say is that the consumer needs to be active in educating themselves and they need to come to really good resources, and that's what we strive to do with an Understanding Ag and the Soil Health Academy on our websites is provide solid science, very good resources, good educational material for the consumer. The second thing that the consumer needs to do is vote with their food dollar. That's absolutely huge. So demand regeneratively produced foods. When you go to your grocery stores, ask about regeneratively produced foods and tell them you want them to carry regeneratively produced foodstuffs. When you go to restaurants, make the same request. And I can
Now,
promise you.
how do
Go
you
ahead.
do that? Because I'm sure they wouldn't even know what the heck you're talking about. Like, is there
Okay.
a regenerative label, or is there, how do you request those? Is there a list of foods or something like that, or farms?
And see that's a very good point. So let me start with this. First, we know through research that your typical grocery chain, retail grocery chain, an individual store, if they have 5 to 8 individuals make an inquiry about something, they don't have to have dozens or hundreds of them, just 5 to 8 customers requesting a food item. They're going to go find and put that item in their store because their
Wow.
research tells them if they have 5 to 8 people actually speaking up and
Mhm.
asking, that there are dozens and hundreds that are wanting it, right?
Wow.
So use your voice. Don't be silent and don't just go in the grocery store and walk out Well, I wish they had so and so.
Hmm.
Tell them that you wish they had so and so. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what are we asking
Yep.
for them?
Yep. So again, if you want regeneratively produced meats, regeneratively produced produce, whatever it is, just tell them that, and then tell them, go inquire with Understanding Ag,
Hmm.
because we have the network to help them source that. Okay. So tell them that point blank. Tell
Hmm.
them, contact the people in Understanding Ag and they can help you with sourcing that product. We also, to help with this, Paul, we just launched a new company this year called Regenify, and that is a regenerative verification company.
Hmm.
And it's designed specifically to do exactly what you're talking about, be able to provide a dependable, trustworthy, transparent source for the consumer to be able to come to and know and trust that they're getting a true regeneratively produced foodstuff. Um, and that's what you're going to have to do. So again, we want to make the consumer aware of Understanding Ag. We want to make them aware of Regenified, so that they have a source to come to help them start to find these things. Now, we need a lot more farmers and ranchers doing this. Okay.
Hmm.
And here's what incentivizes them. And again, this is where the consumer plays a key role. If you, as the consumer, are inquiring about these every time you go to a restaurant, every time you go to the grocery store, then those companies and the food companies that they're sourcing from, see, they're going to go, if they're buying products from General Mills or from Vital Farms or from, Unilever or whoever, right? They're going to go to those companies and say, hey, our customers are asking for regenerative food products. Can you give that to us? And then those companies are going to start to inquire of the farmers that are supplying them. And
Okay.
that's what we have to happen. So when they go to the farmer and they say, you need to be producing this for me, that incentivizes the farmer. So the consumer is critical here. You are the people that can most rapidly move this forward and get regenerative agriculture established at a landscape scale.
Okay. So just basically asking for it. And then at some point, is there like a website that we can go and find which ranchers or which producers are regenerative? Maybe even
That
ask for specific products from those companies or
Yeah,
businesses?
and that's what Regenified is developing. Okay. Give us time, but we are working very, very hard on developing that. So that is so in Regenified is a totally separate company from Understanding Ag. We hired a separate staff, CEO, all of that as a separate board of directors, but our staff at Regenified is working very hard on accomplishing just that. And that will be available and that database will be built over time.
Cool.
But yeah, so that, and then the second thing is to your family and friends, tell them about regenerative agriculture and its benefits to each of them as a consumer. It means cleaner air, cleaner water, better climate, much more nutrient dense food, right?
Yep. Yep.
And it means a much more biodiverse ecosystem that you are supporting. Whether you live in a high-rise apartment building somewhere in an inner city or whatever, it doesn't matter. If you vote with your food dollar, you're supporting all of this outside of where you live.
Awesome. And then for the person like myself, that's, maybe we purchased a house and we have a quarter acre or a half acre land or something, maybe up to an acre. What's the first step to move in a direction of regenerative, this kind of agriculture?
I hear you. So, first of all, you would be amazed at the amount of food that you can grow for yourself on a quarter of an acre or a half an acre. It is absolutely incredible.
Mm.
And so, quit treating that like these manicured, synthetic, and chemically fed lawns, right? We've got to get people out of that mindset that my lawn must have this nice, neat, manicured look. There's no diversity there, and it's chock full of chemicals. Okay. So you need to think about your lawn being this sort of microcosm of diversity. So you want plant species diversity there, and you can have all kinds of gardens there on a quarter acre, a half acre. You can have raised bed gardens, whatever you want to do. And you can also, in a lot of places, you can still have chickens and rabbits and things like that as a protein food source. You can produce eggs, you can produce broilers, you can produce rabbits. So small acreage can still feed families and do it well. And if we get enough of those suburban areas doing this, now you're creating a broader supporting ecosystem. You have more birds coming in and utilizing that diversity. You have more pollinator insects coming in and utilizing that diversity. So you're actually creating habitat to support, all of these wild species of insects and birds and so forth. So you are contributing to ecosystem diversity, even if you just have a quarter acre or a half acre. But and again, it takes enough of people doing this, right? But it works. It works.
Yeah. Yep. So I noticed on your website there's courses. You do have a reading list. So for the person starting out with this, is there a beginner's course or one of the courses? Because I noticed you had a lot. Which course would you recommend? I'm
so
asking
the very
for myself.
first. Yeah, absolutely. So the very first course is called Regen Ag 101. Okay. And it covers the basics of regenerative agriculture. And it has 9 modules and tons of augmented learning material to go along with it. So, we always tell people go through all 9 modules first and watch them. Each module is only about 18 minutes long. Okay. So easily digestible. But watch them first without clicking on the augmented material links. Okay. Then go back the second time and the third time and watch them again and start clicking on all the augmented materials links to deepen your understanding of it. So that's the best place to start. But our website is loaded with webinars, with podcasts, with articles, all of these types of things that are very, very beneficial. And, we've got dozens and dozens of articles there, and we do have a recommended reading list as well.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Alan, thank you so much. Super educational. Can we, I know we'll have some questions from our attendees here. Do we have an optimism? I guess, can we finish with, do you see, based on, because it seems like there's this one end of the spectrum, which is the majority, the modern food system, more and more lands are being bought up for the monoculture system. But then we've got this small pocket of people like yourself, with the people that you interact with, the farmers that you interact with, do you see light at the end of the tunnel? Do we feel like we're making an impact and moving in a good direction?
Absolutely. I'm very, very encouraged. And, again, we have seen interest in regenerative agriculture grow exponentially over the last 10 years. We're busier than we've ever been, and that is because the interest has grown. And this interest has come not just from farmers and ranchers, but consumers and companies and many others that are starting to look into this now in a very serious way. And the interest is growing globally. That's why we're working with people in 41 different countries because of that global interest. So, yes, I think that the future is bright, to be honest with you, if we continue down this path. It's going to radically alter the issues that we're facing today for the better. We'll have far healthier soils. We'll have a far healthier climate. We'll restore a lot of ecosystems that have been heavily damaged. We will produce foods that are far more nutrient dense and therefore will have a healthier population. So yes,
Yep.
I'm hugely optimistic.
It almost seems like we're being forced in this direction with energy shortages, supply chain disruptions, food shortages, fossil fuel, like it's almost like we're having to go back to the basics anyway. So that
Right,
makes me kind of
right.
excited too.
Yep.
Yep. Awesome. All right. So I know I have some questions in the chat, but I did want to just open it up. Does anyone have any questions they want to jump on and just unmute themselves and ask Alan while we have him here?
I have a list of questions. I'm going to try to filter this down to like one, maybe. I guess my biggest question, Alan, is it's, as I understand, the reason why corn and soy are so heavily planted and grown in the States is there are significant subsidies for farmers to be doing that kind of farming. Which obviously is detrimental to our soils. Is there any chance of getting the government to kind of pivot direction and start subsidizing regenerative farming? That seems like that would be incentive enough for them to actually start doing some good for the world. But I also understand that we have the food producers that are demanding that they need the corn and soy because that's how they make all these yummy products that fill the shelves that the masses buy.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. One of the principal reasons we grow so much corn and soybeans is it is very heavily subsidized, no doubt. And farmers have become so used to growing those two crops that honestly they don't know how to grow other crops. Okay, believe it or not, and they have developed very specialized equipment for growing corn and soybeans that it now requires that you purchase additional equipment if you're going to grow another crop. Also, we set up all of our grain elevator systems, all of that for those specific crops. We would have to reestablish, which we're working on, okay, additional elevators to be able to house a plethora of other crops that we can grow and grow successfully. So yes, that is the case, and they've been led to believe that those two crops are quote feeding the world. And the truth of the matter is, there's not a person alive on the face of the earth that sits down to a bowl of field corn or field soybeans in the evening and eats those. You don't. Now we're eating them. You alluded to it, Chandler. We're eating them in a multiplicity of highly processed food products. That's how we're consuming corn and soy products, which makes them very unhealthy for us. So we're consuming them from a human standpoint in a way that is not good at all. However, if there is incentive through markets for other crops, yeah, and I would rather do it that way because it's very, very difficult to get this done through government policy. I'll just say that, okay? Hugely difficult. And we know because we have worked in that arena for a long time, and you get nowhere fast. I would rather this be consumer driven and the farmer respond to consumer demand to be able to alter the crops that they're growing and providing than us trying to work through government and farm bill channels to accomplish this.
Makes a lot of sense. It's almost like it's a principle, because then we could run into a potential similar problem down the road,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Thanks, Chandler.
Is it scalable? One more follow-up.
Yeah.
Is it scalable, Alan? To feed a population, our size, can regenerative farming, if we replaced all the farming with regenerative farming, is it scalable? Will it produce enough?
So the short answer is absolutely. Not only is it scalable, but we can actually produce far more food regeneratively than we do conventionally. And remember what I talked about midway through the segment about the average farmer only produces one crop, per acre per year, or one protein per acre per year. right? And remember when I gave the example of we can produce multiple crops and proteins per every acre every year. We call that stacking enterprises, okay? So through regenerative farming, we can stack enterprises, and I can produce far more food per acre every year than a conventional farmer can ever think about. So I'll repeat it, not only is it scalable, but we will produce far more food than we are currently producing. And oh, by the way, Chandler, far healthier food than what we are producing right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chandler. So Suzanne asks, are our universities teaching the adaptive AG process to our future farmers?
Unfortunately, very, very little. And those that are, it's actually individual professors and teachers within those universities that are doing this or attempting to do this. But universities as a whole have not adopted this at all. And I haven't lived in that world. I'll just tell you why. You support those that provide you the funding.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same in science.
Yeah. Whose names are on the buildings? Whose names are on the endowments and the professorships? Whose names are on the scholarships? Who provides the funding for all the research? And so again, if you follow the money trail, that's where your universities are going to be dedicated to, plain and simple. So regenerative agriculture is the antithesis to that. And so universities are very, and I'll just use the term because it's correct, they're very frightened to make a transition because they'll lose literally billions of dollars in funding that they're currently getting when they make some kind of transition like this. And the other thing that we have to realize is that just like a farmer can't implement what they do not know, they have to first learn regenerative practices before they can implement them. A university faculty can't teach what they do not know. If they have not themselves practiced regenerative agriculture and learned about it, they cannot teach it. And the vast majority of your faculty at most of our universities do not have the knowledge to effectively teach regenerative agriculture.
So it sounds like it comes back to the grassroots movement, the consumer, making requests and more and more people having an awareness about this. And then that would funnel to companies that are looking to produce products and services that align with what consumers are demanding. And then maybe eventually it would get taught somewhere. So,
and that's why we formed the Soil Health Academy, to be able to provide that education that the universities can't provide, plain and simple.
Yep. Well, awesome. I think that's everything that we have. Alan, I appreciate your time. I know that you are extremely busy. It took me several months to get you on the calendar. So thank you so much for providing this information and being selfless with your time. And I know that the best place for us to find more information, including some of the courses you were talking about, is understandingag.com. Is that correct, or is it .org?
It's understandingag.com and then the soilhealthacademy.org. Yep.
Okay, cool. So, and we'll definitely be sharing that, and keep doing what you're doing, man. It's inspiring and exciting from a consumer level, or, just where I'm seeing things. I'm excited to get started myself in some shape or form. It's also great to know that we have people out there fighting the good fight, and that there is a hopeful message amidst all the chaos that we're seeing in the world right now. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Well, thank you for this opportunity and this platform. As I said before, this is important because you are getting the message out to the people that need to hear it. So we are grateful and privileged to have been able to be on.